My name is Ash, and welcome to Paved with Gold, the eating disorder recovery podcast. I want to acknowledge the traditional landowners on which I'm recording, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. If you've been following us on Instagram, you would know that last month I was lucky enough to attend the ANZ AED annual conference, which is the Australian New Zealand Academy of Eating Disorders. And it was an amazing experience to meet a bunch of new people and really gain insight into what academics and clinicians are focusing on in terms of how we can change the way we treat eating disorders. If you want to hear more about our insights on that, there's a whole bunch of little talking heads interviews I've done with some people at the conference, as well as some key insights that I had. You can check that out on our Instagram. But saying that, one of the key takeaways from the conference was this united effort to recognize where we may be going wrong in eating disorder treatment and research, but more importantly, where do we need to go in the future? In particular, there was a real dedicated focus on the role culture plays in the manifestation, treatment, and study of eating disorders, which I found fascinating. And as you can probably tell from the title of this episode, it is what we're going to be talking about today. Again, if you follow us on Instagram, you would have heard of my next guest before. They were very kind to give me a little one-on-one interview after their amazing plenary session on re-indigenizing eating disorder spaces. Today's guest is an Australian-born Māori health researcher and PhD candidate at the School of Social Science and Centre for Social Research in Health at the University of New South Wales. They are a lived experience mental health and diversity advocate and has worked with entities such as the Butterfly Foundation, ACON, and the University of Melbourne. It is my great pleasure to welcome Kacey Martin to the podcast. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
I apologize after the fact as well for having to race after you and be like, hi, I love everything you said. Can I totally just steal you for an hour on the podcast after your session?
No, it was great to meet you at the conference. I met a lot of interesting people doing interesting things. So no, it was nice to meet you, and now I'll be catching up with you again.
Exactly. So, as we often do on the podcast, I would love if you could share a little bit about your lived experience with an eating disorder and how you ended up in this lived experience advocacy role.
Sure. It's hard to know where to start.
We always get that. Everyone's like, how
Yeah.
far back do you want me to go?
Yeah, like I was born and then yeah, I mean, I'll try my best to sum it up. Depending on whether you consider ARFID part of the eating disorder cluster or separate as a feeding disorder, I don't know, there's a lot of discussion around that.
I think all of the above.
Yeah, so I mean, if we include ARFID, then I would say I've probably experienced an eating disorder my entire life.
For those who don't know, ARFID is avoidant and
Restrictive.
restrictive food intake disorder. That's it.
Yes, correct. Then yeah, it would be my whole life. If we're talking about our more, I guess, classic eating disorders, then I would say I probably have had bulimia for half my life. So starting at about age 16, I'm 32 now. So about, yeah, half of my life. But disordered eating would have started a lot earlier than that. I yeah, from my earliest memories, I have had a love-hate relationship with food, I think. ARFID obviously made me very averse, like I had a strong aversion to a lot of foods, new, unfamiliar foods, particularly fruit and vegetables. And as my dad has told me, mealtime was a war zone. When I was young, there were lots of tantrums, there was lots of gagging and like a lot of crying. My parents didn't understand what I was experiencing. They thought I was kind of like, particularly my father thought I was like I was just being naughty, I was being bad. So that obviously would often result in like yelling and punishment, which only kind of intensified the negative emotions that I felt around these foods that I already didn't want to eat.
Yeah, making like meal times even more stressful.
Exactly. And then on the other hand, there was like a very strong kind of dopamine rush I was getting from kind of your more processed kind of fast food type foods from a very young age. And so I kind of had this very love-hate relationship with food from a very young age. And kind of struggled with overeating, struggled with getting quite upset if I couldn't eat what I wanted to eat. Yeah, and people started trying to control what I was eating from quite a young age as well. Like, I remember my father put locks on the fridge when I was in primary school. I was put on lean cuisine frozen meals to try and help me lose weight in primary school again. This was after a doctor told me that I was, or told my parents that I was overweight, I think. Um, yeah, and I guess from probably from the age of 6 or 7, which was when I kind of, looking back on it, I wasn't fat at all, but a family friend, an adult, had made a comment on my stomach, and pretty much from that moment on, I was insecure about my body. I was probably, 6 or 7. So I mean, that's it started early, and then obviously as you become a teenager, um, the pressure to look a certain way, I think, only increases. And for me, I think media played a very big role in my body image and body insecurity. I think media was a big escape for me when I was a kid. I was always watching movies, watching music videos, and it definitely played a big role in what I thought you're supposed to look like, or what you needed to look like to be worthy or likable. And I did not see anyone who looked like me in the media. So,
I was going to ask that question in terms of,
yeah,
I wonder if lack of representation might have something to do with that as well.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think I said in the plenary that Lilo from Lilo and Stitch was the
Yeah.
first time I ever saw a character that I felt kind of like reflected someone that looked like me,
Yeah.
which is very exciting.
Yeah.
I still strongly identify with Lilo.
Yeah, my little niece, she's a quarter Tongan, and her favorite Disney film is Moana.
Yeah,
And she's just like, "Oh, look, it's Moana!" I always get so excited every single time she sees it, because it's so important, especially for little kids, to see yourself
absolutely.
in your mainstream media.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, I mean, yeah, like it's super there's so much I can talk about in terms of my eating disorder. Um, I spoke a little bit in the plenary as well about how, I guess, intergenerational trauma and my moldiness kind of played a role. Um, and so, in a lot of ways, I think some of my more body related insecurities and kind of eating disorder oriented patterns probably come from my father, which
Mm.
is kind of atypical. A lot of people inherit those things from their mothers. While my mother did have like she kind of had negative self talk around her body. She would talk about diets and weight loss and stuff. My father was also, I think because my father experienced such intense racism and self hatred around that, and the
Mm.
feeling that other people would look down on him because of his race, as well as he had a very, very traumatic childhood. He was essentially made a ward of the state at the age of 13. So he had this feeling that he was unwanted and unloved.
Was
But
this
he
in New
was,
Zealand or in Australia?
so he was a ward of the state in Australia.
Okay.
He was brought over from New Zealand when he was, I think, 8 or 9 or something like that. And then, yeah, by the age of 12 or 13, I think he was a ward of the state.
Mm.
So, yeah, he very much had this sense that he was unwanted and unloved, and then that society kind of looked down on him because of his race. But he was also a very handsome boy, very handsome man.
Mm.
And I think for that, because of that, that was kind of his source of esteem, or was maybe what he saw as as his way of being liked by
That's where he places
others.
his value, you know?
Yeah, because other people saw value in his appearance, perhaps. And so I think that kind of got projected onto me. So it was like, you're also Māori. The world isn't going to accept you as you are. The world is not going to like you because you're Māori.
Mm.
And the world and life will be even harder for you if you're large, if you're fat, if you're not attractive. And I think he wanted to give me the privilege that he might felt that he had because of his looks. And unfortunately, it just manifests like in his brain. He was doing the right thing. He was trying to make life easier for me. But my parents were also teenagers, so they didn't know a lot about nutrition. They both had like year 8 educations. They left school in year 8, so they weren't educated. They didn't know what proper nutrition looked like. They didn't know what a healthy relationship with the body is, and yeah, they were quite young. They didn't know what to do, and like even though a lot of harmful things happened, I don't really blame them. They kind of did the best they could. Um, but yeah, and so like the media, my dad, but yeah, high school was really tough for me. My mental health definitely plummeted. I started like self harming, experienced a lot of trauma in my life as well. We had family violence in the home. Trigger warning, I might have to put a trigger warning, but sexual assault and um, as I got older, intimate partner violence and things
Mm.
like that. So my eating disorder very much became a way of, I think, eating was always an um, emotional coping mechanism. Um, but I obviously also struggled a lot with body image, and eventually that manifested in bulimia. So that was when I was about 16. Yeah, and at first, bulimia was like, I thought it was like this amazing thing.
Mm.
Like, it was kind of like almost like a honeymoon period where I was like, this is great. But yeah, it obviously didn't take long for it to become not great and to be like, oh, I actually can't stop.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so yeah, that's kind of, and then like ever since then, I've had really bad phases, but I'd say over the last 10 years, it's been progressively getting better.
Great.
I've been receiving treatment and things like that. Um, yeah, so that's kind of some of my lived experience. But how I got into lived experience advocacy, that's actually very recent. I kind of fell into it really. It started actually with um, sitting on an advisory group with ACON, and that's not for eating disorders.
Mm.
It's for people who've experienced intimate partner violence, sexual violence, or domestic violence. Um, but then through that kind of got me involved in other lived experience opportunities, primarily through the Butterfly Collective, which is the kind of what is it? Yeah, the lived experience kind of network run by the Butterfly Foundation. So that's kind of where I've gotten most of my opportunities through that. And I did it because really it's just representation. I call myself like a reluctant advocate, not because I don't want to be an advocate, but because I don't really like being perceived.
Yeah.
But I didn't see anyone who looked like me who had. I didn't see my experiences being reflected. Um, and I didn't want the same thing that has happened in research historically to be that we only hear kind of one particular voice, which is your kind of younger, whiter,
Cis, het, all
young
of the above.
woman. Yeah, exactly. And I kind of inhabit this like very complex intersectional identity where I'm like nearly everything is like not typical. I'm Maori. Um, I'm a migrant. I'm fat. I'm female, but also non-binary. I'm autistic. I'm all the things, and I just, I thought I I wanted my experiences to be reflected more, and that other people can possibly benefit from, who have shared experiences with me, which is kind of what encouraged me to get involved, even though I'm quite shy.
Well, I appreciate you coming on the podcast to talk about it, especially and being that, like you said, reluctant advocate, because I don't want to put words in your mouth at all, but this idea that you don't really want to be in the spotlight, but you're hoping that by doing so, you might invite someone else to maybe take that role because you
Yeah,
inspired other people, which I think is
yeah,
really, really important.
yeah. I just saw a gap, and like I could just sit around and like cross my fingers that maybe someone like me might fill it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it just kind of had to be well, no one's filling it at the moment, so I'm just gonna have to step up and do that for now.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
we very much appreciate the role that you're filling. That's for sure. I mean, when we were starting this podcast, I've collected a whole bunch of resources that we put on the website
Mm,
and everything, and I try to separate it out based on region. And when I
mm,
was looking for New Zealand and Aotearoa resources, there just really wasn't much available, especially
mm.
for those in Maori.
Yeah.
And I think that was another thing that another takeaway from the conference was there was this amazing showcase of culture there. And I think,
Mm,
especially I'm sure you can relate to this as an Australian, but also as a Maori person, you
mm,
see New Zealand and Aotearoa being this sort of North Star for how you put First Nations at the front and center. But at
mm.
the core of it, there's actually still a lot that still needs to be done.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, there's a lot more that needs to be done. Yeah, it was that was my first ANZ conference. So I don't know what it has been like at previous conferences.
Oh, same. My first one as well. Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't really have anything to compare it to, but yeah, it was great to have that representation and that culture ingrained in this year's conference. We fought really hard for it. So um you would have seen that we have the Māori Eating Disorder Collective, which I am a part of, which is based in Aotearoa. I'm the only Aussie. I'm the resident Aussie in that collective, the Māori Eating Disorder Network. Sorry, I should say. And we were lucky enough that Brittany Beavis, who is part of our network, was also one of the organizers of this year's conference. So we were like,
She was amazing, by the way.
yes, she was great. We were like, come fit us in, trying to like fit us in wherever you can. So yeah, we got a plenary out of it. We got the launch event for our Tidal glossary resource that
Mhm.
we've worked on. So yeah, no, I was really happy with the conference, and I feel like we got a very positive response. I'm just hoping they kind of keep up that work when the conference is based back in Australia,
Hard agree.
wherever. I think it's Melbourne is the next.
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm hoping they are able to work with some local Indigenous people there to try and integrate and yeah, keep it happening every year. That'd be great to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Pardon my ignorance for this because it was hard for me to find this information.
Hmm.
But what is the prevalence of eating disorders in the Maori community, if you
Yeah,
know?
yeah. So I do not blame you for not being able to easily find this
Mm,
information, because there's obviously, with all Indigenous people, there's not a lot of research on eating disorders. Um, so I do have. There are a couple of studies. So we do have some prevalence estimates for anorexia and bulimia. So for anorexia, we have Māori have a lifetime prevalence of 0.7,
mm,
and for bulimia 2.4%. So that is compared to 0.6% and 1.3% for non-Māori. So there is a higher, pretty much almost double lifetime prevalence rate for bulimia and a similar for anorexia. The problem with those estimates, however, is they're quite old. So they were published in 2006.
Oh,
So yeah,
okay.
that's
So nearly 20 years. Okay.
20 years ago, and those are our most recent kind of national prevalence
Okay.
rates.
Yeah. And I
And
assume that even
obviously,
back in 2006, that would still probably be underreported as well. I'm assuming because
yeah, it's
research
possible
is.
for sure. Yeah. And as well, obviously, binge eating disorder had not yet been included in the DSM. So we don't have any prevalence data for binge eating disorder for the Māori population specifically. I believe there are some prevalence rates for the country in general, but not for Māori specifically.
Right.
Luckily, though, I do believe they are preparing to do the second survey because it was part of a big mental health survey. I believe they are starting to prepare for a second survey. So I'm hoping in the next few years we're going to get some more current prevalence rates, which will also include prevalence rates for binge eating disorder. Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, I think that was something that you also touched on in your plenary, is that there needs to be a more focus on both Indigenous specific research as well as including Indigenous samples in wider research groups as well.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, most of what we do know is, which is still not a lot, is in kind of we get some information from broader research. Like, so I know disorder eating, the gap in disordered eating prevalence seems to be even larger when we look at more recent studies with young people. So I think there was a study in 2012 by Utter et al. And I think so. It was a study looking at the kind of weight loss intentions and behaviors of like secondary aged students in Aotearoa. And Māori girls were, I think 10% of Māori girls reported self-induced vomiting in the last year, which was double non-Māori girls. Māori girls were also most likely to report meal skipping in the last year than the non-Māori girls, and were second most likely to report fasting. That was after Pacifica girls. So yeah, like disordered eating as well, we're seeing quite, especially with more bulimic associated behaviors, so binge eating and purging, you're seeing that seems to be substantially higher in Māori people from what we have seen in the research so far.
Do you have any idea of why that might be? Just your
Um,
opinion?
yeah. Based on what I've seen, to my knowledge, this might not be 100% correct, but from what I've seen, I believe binge eating and also purging seem to have a higher correlation with food insecurity in childhood. And we know that Māori people do experience significantly higher rates of food insecurity and financial instability in general, more
Yeah.
likely to come from low socioeconomic backgrounds. I there seems to be mixed findings in the research when I'm looking at that looks at the correlation between trauma and eating disorder
Well, yeah, that's
behaviors.
a huge one. Hey, yeah.
Yeah, but it also seems that binge eating and bulimic tendencies also seem to have a higher correlation to more adverse childhood experiences and trauma, which is also true. Māori also have been found to experience more childhood adversity and trauma. I think I was looking, they had the adverse childhood experience questionnaire. I was looking at some research recently, and I believe it was 25%, around 25% of Māori have a score of 4 or higher on the adverse childhood experience questionnaire. So, which is quite high.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, those are kind of two things that I think could be a contributing factor. Um, yeah, trauma, food insecurity are some of them. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But I'm sure there's other things at play as well.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
You're an encyclopedia of knowledge about this, and with like just pulling stats off the top of your head. I'm very impressed. I can barely
I
remember.
did a little bit of preparation, I will be honest.
Well, still, my memorization is definitely not as good. So, yeah, it's yeah. So there was one thing that that you touched on in your plenary, and that I definitely wanted to ask you about, and we've sort of touched on it lightly. So I'm going to formally open
Hmm.
the door to it. Hello. So you're Australian born, however, obviously you're a Maori person,
Hmm.
and you mentioned in your plenary how one of the things that you really would love to see is more First Nations resources available to people both in Aotearoa as well as in Australia.
Hmm.
And you mentioned that obviously being Maori in Australia, that is probably something that you won't ever be able to experience because accessing First Nations care in Australia would mean for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders,
Hmm.
First Nation Australians.
Yeah.
And as a Maori person, that's you want them to get that first, and that was
Yes,
something that you wouldn't
absolutely.
experience. Can you talk a little bit about what your experience of being a Maori person in Australia is
Mhm.
like, if that makes sense?
Yeah, for sure. My experience, well, I was very disconnected from Maori people besides my dad, because he was, like, as I said, he was a ward of the state, so he didn't have really family. He didn't have a relationship with his family. And I grew up in a predominantly white area of Sydney, which is, the kind of Gladesville Ryde area of Sydney. So it was I mostly went to school with white kids, though there was some cultural diversity. There was, Asian and um, Indian and Muslim people as well. But I think I went to school in primary school. I think there was one other. Well, actually, I'll start with this. One of the first thing is, so in Aotearoa, there's a very clear distinction that is made between Māori and Pacifica people. They are very much seen as different, and there's a logic to that. It's because in Aotearoa, Māori are indigenous,
Mm,
Pacifica are a migrant community. However, being Māori in Australia kind of complicates that distinction a little bit, because the whole reason we have that distinction in Aotearoa is because of that indigenous and migrant kind of status. In Australia, though, Māori are also a migrant group. We aren't
mm,
indigenous. And so in Australia, you know, when I was a kid, you kind of identified with any Polynesian other person.
mm,
So if I went to school with a Tongan or a Samoan or whatever, even though, we're different, we're not the same, we very much would quickly kind of identify with one another,
yeah.
because you don't really you didn't have a bunch of Māori people you could kind
Mm.
of, so
It's kind of
we
like
would
the
kind of,
closest that like
yeah,
community that
like,
you could
yeah,
adopt to,
close
right?
enough.
In
Yeah,
terms
we're
of,
kind of like
we have
cultural
similarities.
cousins.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
You have
We're
more in
kind of
common
like
with them
cultural
than
cousins.
you would with,
Exactly.
uh, white
Yeah.
folk, I
So
suppose.
yeah, and so like there's pretty much there's like obviously there's very limited research on eating disorders and Māori in Aotearoa. There's literally zero research on Māori in Australia.
Mm,
And the research that does kind of look at Māori health in Australia, we do tend to be grouped in with
yeah.
islanders or Polynesians. So it's looking more at Polynesian health in Australia, in which Māori are included in that group.
Yeah.
So, um, yeah, so the first thing is that identity is kind of different, I suppose. You expand your group to kind of see yourself as an islander. It's
Mm,
very confusing because, like, on one hand, I would have my stepdad, who was also Maori, being like, "We're not islander, like we're Maori, we're not islander," but then like everyone else be calling me islander.
yeah.
No, telling in Australia, telling me I am islander. So I was like, well, what is it? Am I islander? Am I not islander? So it was confusing being Māori in Australia. And I think as well, being Māori in Australia, not having any connection to Māori community or culture, I really didn't want to be Māori. I wanted to be white,
Mm.
and I'm half. My mother is white, and I grew up around my white family, and I grew up around white people, and I think I felt on the inside I was a white person, and I hated that I didn't look white, and that people didn't treat me white, even though everything I knew at that point was mostly white. My dad did his best to kind of give me Maori culture and like a strength and identity, but he didn't know much himself. And my mum was actually, my mum was quite good at trying to keep me connected to culture too. She tried to get me to do Te Reo classes when I was little, but I was very resistant and distractible, so that didn't necessarily work.
Yeah.
Um,
Especially because you probably had this, oh, I don't want anything to do with that because I want to be, you want to quote unquote assimilate more with the, with
yeah, yeah.
whiteness.
Well,
Yeah.
I was a bit that was when I was 3 or 4, so it
Oh,
was a
right.
bit
Sorry. My bad.
before I became kind of conscious of race.
Mm. Oh, gosh.
That
Yeah.
probably started more when I was like 6 or 7 and
Mm.
stuff like that. But yeah, being Māori in Australia, and so kind of going for what you were saying, yeah, I'm a big advocate for First Nations, Indigenous peoples, and yeah, in Australia, that's not me. I want to see that work being done with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Obviously, I want more cultural inclusivity for everyone in Australia, and that includes culturally and linguistically diverse communities,
Mm.
which is where I suppose Māori would fit in, but yeah, the most of the work I'm doing is in the Indigenous space. Um, so yeah, it is complicated, but I think another thing I was talking about in the plenary was I actually think everyone can benefit from more Indigenous approaches to health. Like, we know that Indigenous models of health are more holistic,
Mm.
are more community and family oriented, and I think that could be beneficial for everyone. So even if I was going to a service that I knew had been co-designed with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, I would probably still feel safer in that service and more catered to in that service than I would in a service that maybe wasn't or hadn't been co-designed with Indigenous or culturally and linguistically diverse people.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear you talk about that and the like cultural connection and the impact that that has. My husband's actually half Cook Islander,
Oh,
and
yeah. Yeah.
yeah, so and he very similarly, his father was shipped off to New Zealand at the age of 4, and there was this big disconnect from him and a lot of intergenerational trauma of okay,
Yeah.
not being as part of that community, and then just he never grew up with that, and he was very much born and raised in Maroubra and very
Yeah.
white focused, and it just has, and he almost feels, I'm sure he won't mind me saying this, he feels very disconnected from his culture, and only recently has he been able
Mm,
to really connect with that. And it's a very interesting, and it's quite, oh, I feel really sad that he wasn't able to experience that and
mm.
not able to embrace it. And he says, I feel like a bit like a fraud, even though
Yeah.
he is absolutely half
Imposter
Cook,
syndrome.
absolute imposter syndrome. He's
Yeah.
half Cook
Yeah.
Islander, like he's, even got the citizenship and all of that, but he still
Yeah.
feels like, I feel like I have no knowledge of it. And I feel, yeah,
Hmm.
like a fraud. So and I guess that is a form of trauma as well, of just
Yeah.
almost being deprived of your culture.
Hmm. I think that's an incredibly common experience.
Mm,
So my brothers are also like half Maori, and we always talk about how we don't feel like we belong we're like too white to fit into Maori spaces and too Maori to fit into white
mm,
spaces. So you don't ever feel like you really have an area where you belong. And I think that's very common for um, Maori who have both Maori and or European or any other ancestry, or Māori who have grown up very separate and disconnected. And similar to your husband, my cultural reconnection journey is a recent one.
Mm.
It's really only taken place over like the last 4 or 5 years, I would say, and I'm still very, very, very early in my journey as well. And interestingly enough, what made me want to do that was 6 years ago. Um, I got a research assistant position, researching sexual health, and relationships among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here in Sydney, and learning more about kind of just the Indigenous theory, decolonization methodologies, and stuff like that through that process made me more interested in wanting to learn more about my own culture. My own Māori kind of heritage and culture, and then, I mean, just university in general had me learning more about race and culture and intersectionality and all of these things, and gave me a new lens to, I guess, understand my experience. Um, yeah, and I think my research, or my kind of going into academia in general, has very much been driven by my pursuit of self understanding,
Mm.
trying to understand the world and where and how I fit into that world. Has driven, my interest in sociology in particular and cultural studies, but also, has kind of driven what I've ended up researching for my master's and now doctoral research.
Yeah, so I guess the next question I have for you then is, based on both your lived experience and the research that you've done, where and how does eating disorder treatment fall short for Maori people, apart from everywhere and in every way, kind of?
Yeah, yeah. I think I think you'll find. So I'm going to expand the question a little bit to
Please
talk
do.
about the barriers to access to care in general, as
Mhm.
well as when they actually do access care, what's not meeting people's needs.
Yes.
So I think there was a study in 2020 that was released, that was published by Cameron Lacey and others, um, that looked at um, who was accessing public mental health specialist services for eating disorders. And I believe it was 7% of who was accessing those services for eating disorders were Māori. 7%. Māori make up around 20% of the population. And we know that Māori experience eating disorders at a similar or higher rate. So
And
to
that's
have
in Aotearoa?
Aotearoa,
Yeah,
yes.
cool.
So for that to be only 7% of public health specialist mental health users, um, tells us that there's probably significant underdiagnosis and significant not sorry not a lot of access to treatment happening, for Māori people with eating disorders, and so there's obviously a lot of barriers, and some of those barriers are, I think, universal. So like cost is obviously, I think, the biggest barrier for nearly everyone.
Yeah.
The cost and just the inaffordability of the amount of treatment that is required to overcome especially a long lasting kind of chronic eating disorder. If it's not early intervention, it really requires intense focus. So cost is obviously a big one. As we've already spoken about, Māori tend to be more likely to experience financial insecurity. So cost is a big barrier. We also have the geographic location where hospital beds are located. When for a lot of people, obviously, family is important for everyone, but whānau is a massive thing in Māori culture. Some people are not willing to leave their family support systems to go and get treatment in another city. Um, there's a massive institutional distrust among Māori because of the role that hospitals and schools and researchers and all that kind of stuff have played in kind of oppressing Māori people through our colonization. So there is distrust in hospitals, in doctors, and in the health system in general at times. So that might be based on that kind of historical aspect, but also people have had really bad experiences. They might have had experiences of racism, or they might have heard of their aunt or their parent having experiences of racism in the health system, which makes them less inclined and feel less safe to access those services in the first place. We also have just a lack of eating disorder and cultural literacy among health practitioners
in general, but
and
even more
in
so
general,
for
but
Māori
obviously
folk.
those stereotypes can be a barrier. It might take longer for the doctor to go, well, actually, you know what, this is an eating disorder, because they don't think of maybe a larger bodied Māori man or woman as kind of being that kind of fitting the stereotype of someone who would experience an eating disorder.
Yeah.
And also, similarly, those stereotypes could be a barrier for Māori people themselves, recognizing that they might have an eating disorder or that their family member could have an eating disorder. Yeah, and then when it comes to actual treatment and how it might be falling short, I think, well, this is also a universal issue, but eating disorder treatment can be extremely coercive, extremely agency diminishing. For Māori,
Yeah, doing it to you as opposed to doing it with you.
yeah, exactly. Agency and self determination is incredibly important for Māori, and I think that's what we need to find ways of doing that better in care. I think I think our screening tools probably haven't been validated for Māori people and could probably be improved or adapted.
I
I
wouldn't say probably. I
Yeah,
think they
yeah.
should.
I'm not good at I always say things like maybe, should, probably. I'm
I
not
think
good
we
at
can
making
read between the lines here.
yeah. But yeah, and treatment is overly individualistic. I think the kind of biomedical paradigm that is quite popular in Western treatment approaches. Um, I think Māori tend to gravitate to more holistic, more whānau, more community oriented or inclusive approaches. Um, I think as well, when it comes to treatment, it can be um, it can be kind of not integrative, because I think most people with eating disorders experience comorbidities.
I would say,
And
like, this is absolutely anecdotal, but pretty much every single person that we've spoken to on this
right, I've never met
podcast.
a person with an
Yeah.
eating disorder that didn't have something else going on, whether that
Yeah.
was another mental illness
Trauma
or neurodivergence, trauma. There's something else happening.
or all of
But
the above.
yeah, and the way we kind of treat eating disorders is quite separate sometimes. So it's quite so, I've heard of people that couldn't access eating disorder treatment because they needed to treat some other condition before they could get access to the eating disorder treatment.
Yeah.
So things like that, I think, can act as barriers. So I think we need just more integrative care, more holistic care, more whānau community oriented approaches. But yeah, I think that those are some of the areas where treatment isn't quite working. And as we know, I highly doubt any of the research studies that have gone to validate specific treatments for eating disorders have included Māori or many Indigenous people at all. So yeah, I think we need to improve the research as well, to find better solutions. Yeah, not just for Māori people, but for everyone in general.
Hard agree. And that was one thing I was going to say. It's something that you touched on earlier, which is I think everyone can benefit from a more inclusive approach because,
Mm-hmm.
like you said, there there is this one size fits all approach to treatment right now, pretty much. And I think that there is this resistance also to other methodologies or other treatments or other different avenues that you can go down. And maybe for some people, a more holistic approach or taking things from different cultures may work for them as well. I think if we
Yeah.
just broaden our horizons and be like, hey, why don't you try this? It would benefit absolutely everybody.
100%. And I guess speaking from my own experience, this isn't like research. I'm putting my experience hat on now, but
We
yeah,
love
like
that hat.
having I've never having access treatment before. It definitely has never felt like those treatments were designed with someone like me in mind. Like it always, firstly, the approaches have always felt like they were designed for people who thought they were fat, but were not fat.
Yes, 1000%.
Right? So the things you would say to someone who is not fat but thinks they're fat is not applicable to someone who is fat.
Yeah, like for some it's just realigning what they perceive with what is reality, whereas what if what that person
What if
perceives
that
is
is the
absolutely
reality?
reality? Yeah.
Is the reality, or it's easy to tell me, it doesn't matter what other people think about you, blah blah blah, but it does.
It does, yeah.
Discrimination is real.
It's just
Prejudice is real.
it's invalidating your experience
It
of weight
feels
stigma.
invalidating to say, it's kind of like this anxiety around what people think of you is all in your head. It's not.
Yeah,
It's based on actual lived experience of being, shat on for being, well, for whatever it is, for being fat, for being Māori, for being whatever. And so yeah, and like things like that, they'd be like, all right, we're going to challenge our fear foods. I don't have fear foods. I'm not scared of food. I have trigger foods that I binge. Like, it's very much felt like they were trying to fit me in the best that they could,
yeah,
rather than fitting the treatment to me. They were trying to fit me into the treatment.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sure many people have that experience.
Based again on the amount of the guests that we've had, many of them express the same thing.
Yeah.
Just one thing in particular, on our episode we chatted to Nick McDermott, and she was talking about how she was on a food challenge, and you had to go and have afternoon tea with quote unquote fun food. We all, yeah, I have feelings around that word because all food's fun, but also just, yeah, we all know what it means.
Yeah.
And she was, writing down on her challenge, worksheet, oh, I'm worried that me eating a piece of cake in public, people are going to attack me, people are going to judge me, all of, XYZ. And the facilitator was like, oh, but do you really think that's real? And she said, yes, because I've experienced that. And
Yeah.
this idea of having people who don't have that lived experience, particularly in of experiencing weight stigma, being like, oh no, it's all in your head. It's completely
Absolutely.
invalidating.
I mean, yeah, even just like trying to access services, I've encountered like a lot of weight stigma. So like literally the first time I ever went to a doctor to go, I have an eating disorder, I have bulimia, I think I need help. She went, I don't think that's the main problem. I think we need to focus on you losing weight. Like that was the first time I ever reached out, and then it delayed me access. I didn't ask for help for like another 3 years, and
Well,
my
why
eating
would
disorder
you?
got worse.
Why
So
would
it
you?
delayed my access to care, and then this is even more recently. I tried to access another service for complex mental health. I don't know whether I want to name or shame the organization or not, but
I can
I
bleep it
won't
if you
do it.
like.
I won't shame it. I won't name and shame. But it was a service for it was free community based service for complex mental health support. And you got like this was a peer, I think it was a peer person, but it was a peer with mental health problems, not an eating disorder peer. And I told him that I had an eating disorder and blah, 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 blah. Then he asked me what my BMI was, and I told him what my BMI was. And he started telling me how he got a gastric bypass, and have I considered getting a gastric bypass because he's really happy that he got one. And I was just like, as soon as that happened, I completely disengaged from the service. I was just like, no, no, not for me, not happening. Yeah,
For anyone who can't see, I've got this massive face palm going on, both hands, because I just can't. It's. Ugh. I think there's a general lack of mental health literacy in community at large in general,
Yeah.
but the amount of the poor eating disorder mental health literacy is even worse than that, because even people
Yeah.
within mental health spaces are
Hmm.
just like, oh, eating disorders. Oh, do you want diet advice? No, Frank, I
Yeah.
don't.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot of barriers to get to accessing care.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it's going to be for Māori people. It's going to be because they're Māori, but you know, a lot of Māori people live in larger bodies as well. So weight stigma is also probably a massive barrier for a lot of Māori people trying to access care.
Yeah, I was going to ask this question and I didn't want to, but we're here now. So, I did want to right when you were talking about your initial going to the doctor and the doctor telling your parents that, oh, she's overweight, quote
Mm,
unquote. Um, yeah, and I wonder if there's any, well, there probably is, the relationship and the intersections between medical weight stigma and medical racism as well.
hmm hmm
And because we also chatted to Hayden Moon a few episodes ago, who was talking about their experience as well about medical racism as an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person, as well as having an eating disorder, and pretty much the same thing. Their experience in the medical system was incredibly influenced by medical racism as well as medical weight stigma. And this idea of you will be taken away if you are not small.
Yeah, so I think they are highly intersectional. I think some of the same issues that contribute to poorer mental health among Indigenous populations also contribute to higher weight.
Mm.
Um, but also physiologically, we are just built different. And
Genetics,
even
man.
though I hate the whole BMI thing in the first place. Believe there is a BMI now, a specific BMI modification for Māori and Pacifica people,
Mm.
which I think there's a larger weight in which you're classified healthy, or it's higher before you get classified as overweight for Māori, because we have higher muscle and fat. I
Mm.
don't know. I'm not a sciencey person. I don't know. I don't know much about biology, but I mean, I question the whole BMI scale. Obviously, it's bullshit. So,
I mean,
um,
look, I appreciate that they're willing to look at changing it to be more accommodating, but you also missed the part where we said we don't want it at all. So how
yeah,
about we not modify something that's terrible
yeah,
and shouldn't be
yeah, and
used to classify health whatsoever?
yeah, and I think one of the biggest ways I can think of this in relation to like eating disorders is just the medicalization of obesity in general
Mm.
is highly racialized. Um, where we look for a long time, especially before binge eating disorder was included in the DSM, where we looked at undereating and vomiting as eating disorder,
Mm.
but binging as just you're weak,
Mm.
you don't have self control, you're a bad person, you're not disciplined, rather than maybe you have a condition and you need support. Um, and even though it's included in the DSM, I still think that rhetoric still exists.
100%. Yeah.
Um, yeah, if you want to look up Māori research on eating disorders, not much. If you want to look up Māori obesity related
Mm.
research, there's a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
So they're much more interested in making us less fat than they are in treating what for some people could be an underlying eating disorder, which may be contributing to metabolic issues and diabetes and things like that. They want to treat the fatness rather than
Treat the
what
mental
else might
health.
be. Yeah, what else might be? I don't want to say that all people who are large have eating disorders. That's not
Mm.
true, are unhealthy. But some people, large people, do have eating disorders, and some people's health issues may be because of an eating disorder. And yeah, it's sad that that isn't being researched, because fatness is the thing people see and think is the problem more than um, a possible eating disorder.
Or
Yeah,
just health in general.
or just health in general. Yeah, yeah.
Well, that's the mic drop soundbite right there. Like,
So yeah, I'd like to see less obesity research and more mental health research for Māori. Yeah, yeah, and just more holistic. If you want to talk about diabetes and whatever, let's just talk about diabetes and particular behaviors or particular, rather than I don't think it's necessary to treat the fat, really.
mm.
You know, as long as you're eating healthy, as long as you're eating balanced, as long as you're happy, and
Or
you
as long
know,
as you're striving to maintain a personal, individualized approach to health that is a
absolutely,
perfect balance
whatever.
between socioeconomic factors, genetic factors,
Hmm.
time
It
factors.
looks different for everyone.
Exactly. That's what I
Yep.
would like to see focused on.
And people want different things as well.
Shocker.
Yeah, who would have known? Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, that's the biggest way I can think of how those things have intersected um, in ways that relate to myself. Yeah,
I love that you definitely segued, setting up for a nice segue here. Oh, I know that we've already kind of talked about it, but I definitely want to ask this question in full as its own sort of standalone question. And you talked a lot about there was an excellent moment in your plenary where obviously the session was called Re-indigenizing Eating Disorder Spaces. And then you just said, I mean, I don't think it's re-indigenizing, it's just indigenizing
yeah,
because, yeah, it's kind of it needs to be done first, which I
yeah,
absolutely loved. And I think you got massive snaps for that one in the room. Um, so, what does culturally inclusive care look like to you?
yeah, yeah. Sure. Um, yeah. So you're absolutely right. Like the whole re-indigenizing concept. I don't think applies to eating disorder spaces because they've never been Indigenous inclusive. So yeah, I'd love to see more co-design with Indigenous peoples. I would love to see more Indigenous people in the workforce as health practitioners supporting people with eating disorders. I would love to see more Indigenous researchers. I would love to see more Indigenous research participants.
Mm.
That is, you know, underpinning the knowledge that goes on to inform those treatments and inform that practice. I think re indigenizing applies to Indigenous peoples themselves, so reconnecting with our culture, um, and not just because culture can be a way of strengthening pride and stuff, but it gives us new discourses and paradigms on how we understand food, for example, maybe how we understand the body, how we value our bodies, or what the purpose of our bodies. It gives us alternative lenses to understand things in relation to eating disorders that might be more useful for us to, like, maybe it's easy, maybe it can help heal our relationship with both our bodies and food if we have new paradigms to see them through. But I think when it comes to like actually working with a person, like an individual, and you wanting to give culturally inclusive care, I think the important thing to remember is we're incredibly diverse. So Māori people are still all going to have different cultural needs. Firstly, because everyone is at a different level of their kind of how connected they are with their culture. That journey is different for everyone. Some people might have no cultural knowledge, very little connection to their community, and they might not have a very strong ethnic identity. That might not be important to how they see themselves. other people might have been raised in a very culturally strong environment with a very strong community. They might be fluent at all. They might completely not identify with the kind of typical Western biomedical approach, in which the cultural needs are going to be incredibly different for that person. So I think asking is really important. Asking someone, do you see culture as playing a role in your healing journey? If so, what does that look like for you? And how can I help support that? I honestly think asking is like one of the most important things. I think a lot of people think I need to like read and I need to just know everything about how to culturally provide for someone, but everyone is different. And I don't think there's anything wrong with asking. Yeah.
There's
I
nothing
mean,
wrong with asking.
maybe some people don't want to be asked, but yeah, because that's really going to look different for everyone.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
That is, it's one of those, it seems like a very obvious answer, but unfortunately, it's absolutely not obvious. Just ask the person what they need and then do that thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes it might be like, okay, well, I don't know a lot about that, so I'm going to need to learn some more about that. Or it might be, I actually don't know if I'm going to be able to provide the right care for this person. But because I'm so well prepared for this situation, I have built networks with Indigenous people, with other practitioners who do know how to work with Indigenous peoples, and I'm going to refer this person to someone I think who can provide them with care. So I think also network, acknowledging that you will not be able to provide the care necessary to everyone. You know, there's only so many hats someone can hold, but it's about building those networks so you know who to refer, how to easily refer someone to the care they need if you don't think you would be able to provide that care. So I think
And there's nothing
building
wrong
more.
with not being able to provide either. Absolutely nothing
Yeah,
wrong.
yeah, it's about knowing it's okay to say you don't know, or it's okay to accept that you have limitations as a practitioner, but it's about building connections and networks with people who can fill those gaps and being able to refer people to people who will be able to provide the care that they need. Yeah, so those networks are really important. I think professional networks, resources that we can, so we can link Indigenous people in with the right services.
Yeah. And another thing to add on to that is that by trying to fill that role that you're not entirely qualified for or that you are unable to provide, you could potentially be doing harm to that person as
Absolutely.
well.
Yeah. 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 Like, some people might try and go, I have an Indigenous client. I'm going to try and learn these Indigenous concepts, but, there's only so much like a quick Google of a concept can teach you, and go, actually, you know what? I'm happy to give you care, but maybe I should also send you to this other person who I know knows a lot about Mātauranga Māori to our Māori, and maybe they'll be able to fill in that cultural gap while I can provide the kind of clinical support. It's about, because you don't want to risk, kind of misrepresenting or not getting, kind of not misrepresenting or misusing
Or
Indigenous
generalizing.
knowledge or Indigenous concepts or Indigenous approaches.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah.
And also, it's a great opportunity to link people in and support Māori or Indigenous healers or cultural teachers and stuff
Mm,
like that. Linking them in and
100%.
it's supporting them and giving them someone who needs their services. Yeah.
Absolutely. 100%. Hard agree. Again, another mic drop moment. Again, it just seems so simple, but unfortunately, common sense ain't common enough. Um, I'm conscious of eating up too much of your time. So I wanted to ask before I bring us in for a landing,
Hmm.
I want to talk about your research a little bit
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
you are a PhD candidate and
I
you were
am.
the ANZ AED Indigenous Scholarship Award recipient. Congratulations, which is very
Thank
exciting.
you.
Um, so, yeah, can you tell us a little bit about what your research is about and how your
Hmm.
lived experience has informed that?
Absolutely. So my research is very much informed by my lived experience because I Google scholared Māori eating disorder and Australia, and there was nothing. Like I said, I do research to try and understand myself, and I'm like, this simply won't do. How will I ever understand myself if there's no research on it? So
It's like,
I
fine, I'll do it
decided
myself.
I will do that research. Exactly. Yeah, I mean, it came from a desire to see, you know, do I have a unique experience or do I have a shared experience? And we do have a little bit of information about eating disorders in Māori, but maybe the experience is different for Māori in Australia, and I assume it might be. We're going to have access to different health services. There aren't going to be any Māori health services in Australia like there are in Aotearoa. But also, we have the eating disorder Medicare scheme thing that New Zealand does not have. So, in one way, we may actually have more funded support in Australia than Māori do in New Zealand for that kind of thing. So, the experiences I assume will be quite different. So my research is about the experiences and understandings of eating disorders. I don't know if I said that right. I'll rephrase that. So my research is about Māori people's understanding and experiences of eating disorders, specifically in Australia. Um, I'm a qualitative researcher, so they will be interview based, and I plan on talking to people with lived experiences of disordered eating and eating disorders.
Love to hear
Um,
it.
it will not be by diagnosis; it will be self-identifying.
Absolutely love to
Um,
hear that even more.
and more based on whether that person has exhibited behaviors rather than whether they identify with a disorder, because I do want to break out of that kind of clinical labeling, which might not be appropriate for Māori people. Um, and yeah, I mean, I'm still in my first year, so the research part of it hasn't started. I'm still in the research design phase, the literature review phase, and things are subject to change. Like originally, my research was going to be in Australia and Aotearoa. Now it's just going to be based in Australia, because that research is kind of already being done, thank God, in Aotearoa by some of my colleagues in the Māori Eating Disorder Network. Um, but yeah, that's kind of what my research looks at. I work in my background is in sociology and cultural studies, so it will be looking at it from a more sociological perspective. So I'll probably be looking at things like identity, connection to culture, so how socioeconomic background has shaped someone's experiences, as well as kind of family dynamics, um, the role of media and culture and race and all that kind of stuff. So those are the questions I'm kind of interested in answering. Yeah, that's kind of a summary of what I think I'm going to be doing for my research.
It's so good to hear that, you know, we're actually seeing research being done in this space, but it's also conducted by people, like the right people who need to be conducting this research. So Maori people,
Yeah,
people with lived experience, that
absolutely.
kind of stuff. Because, you know, it's good that it sucks that the research hasn't been done yet, but also you need the right people to do it. And I think
Absolutely, yeah.
because I think we were talking to Kai Schweizer, who's a queer researcher, who pretty much said the same thing. He said, you know, there hasn't been any real research done on trans folk with eating and non gender non-conforming people with eating disorders, but that's probably it's a, you know, blessing in disguise, because it might not have been done in the most informed way if it had been
Mm,
done by someone not part of the community. So I think
yeah.
that's definitely so good to hear that the research is slowly coming around to recognizing that, which is great. And it's absolutely, and we definitely cannot wait to see what happens. Yeah, we'll be
Thank you.
keeping our eyes peeled on that one.
Yeah, I'm
So
terrified but excited.
I think every PhD candidate we've spoken to has pretty much said the same thing. It's like, it's great and terrifying.
Yeah, yeah. It's a strange mixture of feelings.
Well, there's only one question that I have left on the list that I want to ask you, and it's always the one that we enjoy asking the most.
Yeah.
And it is, what brings you the most joy as you navigate your recovery journey?
I'm gonna have to go with cats. Primarily cats.
Kacey has an amazing set of earphones with cat ears on them.
Yes, I'm a massive cat person. I have two cats. They have been more effective for my mental health than medication, than therapy. I mean, those things have also been helpful. I don't want to diminish the usefulness of those either, but cats definitely.
Holistic approach, right?
Yeah, cats. Cats. Nature. I like going to the beach.
Mm.
I like birds. I feel like once you keep 30, you're just like, I like bird watching now. Um, I think it's kind of like the adult version of Pokemon Go. You kind of just want to tick them all off the list. You just want to tick off your Pokedex. You know what I mean?
That is an excellent
Um,
description. I love it.
I like slime. Slime
Hmm.
brings me joy.
Tactile,
And
sensory, love it.
yep, and travel. And I think I've learned to. I haven't made peace with my body,
Mm.
but I've learned. I feel like I've gotten better with a kind of a body neutrality approach. I think that's been really important for me. I don't know if I will ever love my body. I don't know if
Mm.
I'll ever be able to feel positive about it
Yeah.
or how it looks anyway. But
Mm.
I find body neutrality has been incredibly useful for me. Um, Going through my journey
Mm.
of recovery, which is probably, recovery is such a strange concept.
Oh, we have very strong feelings about the use of the word like recovered, recovery,
Yeah,
those kind of things. Because just
yeah,
like eating disorders, they're extremely individual, and it's
yeah. But
what
at
that
the
means
same
to you.
time, recovery kind of implies that you will get back something that you once had. I'm not
Mm.
going to ever be. There was never a before, right? There was never a before. I'm never going to, and even if there was a before eating disorder phase, I'm never going to be that person again. I'm going to be forever changed, and that's
Mm.
okay because everyone's always changing all the time. We're not recovering. Um,
That is a
I don't know.
great way to put it.
It's a weird concept to me, but I still actively have an eating disorder. I'm still actively receiving support for
Hmm.
managing that eating disorder. Over time, it gets slowly and slowly better with dips and rises.
Hmm.
So I don't know what that looks like, but yeah, it's definitely cats. Definitely cats. Everyone should get a cat.
Yeah, I think you touched on something that, again, we're always talking about on this podcast, which is recovery and maintenance. Even if like
Mm,
recovered isn't an end goal, it's just how do you maintain the an optimal level of health for yourself at the time. And
yeah.
also this idea of being recovered kind of also negates the role that an eating disorder can play, especially if you've got a lot of intersectionalities and comorbidities with that. Like
Mm,
there are so many people who talk about their eating disorder kept them safe as a
mm,
result of trauma or family violence or interpersonal intimate intimate
yeah.
partner violence or
Mm.
weight stigma or those kind of things. Like a lot of eating disorders are an extremely successful coping mechanism. And
Oh
then
yeah.
by
There's always you're getting something from it, even
exactly.
though you know there's a give and take. You wouldn't do it if you didn't get something out of it, whether it's a distraction, whether it's
Hmm.
a sense of control, whether it's a very quick fix of dopamine to like
Hmm.
make your brain light up
Yeah,
like you just won something. It's effective, and that's why people do it, because it
exactly.
works, and it's
It They
hard.
work.
Yeah, it's hard to learn how to manage those things or get whatever you're trying to get from the eating disorder. It is hard to, and it takes time to fill those gaps with healthier coping mechanisms.
Absolutely.
Especially when those healthier coping mechanisms are usually a lot harder work in some ways, and they take a lot of consistent habit learning, and it takes a lot of time, and they don't give you the the
instant
quick
gratification.
dopamine rush that you maybe a binge does. It's like a little dopamine. You just got to be like, yep, that's enough, I guess. I guess I'm just gonna have to be happy with that. So it takes time.
Absolutely. And just because recovery is really, really difficult, and that you may not be 100% ever rid of an eating disorder, that doesn't mean that you are not able to have a better quality of life at some point.
Absolutely. And you know what? That's actually one of the things I think pushed me also into the advocacy space. For a while, I felt like advocacy was always like the most dominant voices in advocacy were always people who had this kind of restorative, like, recovery, who had, I am recovered and now I live this amazing life. And I can't identify with that. I don't know if I'll ever be recovered, but you know what? My life now is so much better than my life was 10 years ago. And like, I'm almost happy sometimes. Like, I feel like professionally, I'm hitting my goals. I have a relatively chill life nowadays. I've escaped the kind of traumatic, chaotic environment I found myself in, sometimes putting myself in. But I have a relatively stable life. I have my cats. I get to travel. I get to research and meet really interesting people in my work. Like, my life, you can have quite a fulfilling life and still be not recovered. It's not black or white. It's not like you're sick and you have this horrible, sad existence, and then you're not sick and now you're happy and everything's great. Often you can be sick and still have a good life, and you can be recovered and still have a shit life. Like, these things are not
100%.
Like, life is still complicated when you get recovered. You're still going to be sad. You still might have a bunch of other mental health or physical health conditions that are making life difficult for you. It's so nuanced, and I wanted to also represent that in my advocacy.
Yeah, you pretty much perfectly encapsulated why we end on this question. Is because part of the reason this podcast exists is because we want to amplify those lived experience voices, and we want to create a realistic and approachable collection of recovery stories that could resonate with everybody. Some people may recover fully, whatever that means, and never have another eating disorder thought again, and they go off and live the most amazing, happy life. I think I've met one person like that.
Yeah,
but then
it's not the majority, is it?
It's not the majority. But then there are so many people who, yep, I still have certain things. I live in recovery maintenance, but my life is so much better. Yep, I still kind of am in an active recovery constantly, but my life is so much better. It always ends kind of in the same way, which is my life is definitely better. And you learn, it's this journey of self-discovery, and you learn, I think a perfect way that you said it was, I'm never going to be the same person because there's nothing to recover. There's no before, because there was always something not quite functioning in the way that in your relationship with food. So yes, that is exactly why we end on this question, because everybody's recovery journey is different, just like everybody's eating disorder is different. So
Absolutely.
I want to thank you so much for your honesty with that question, because it's so important.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, it has been such an absolute joy talking to you. I'm sure we could do it for hours, but again, I don't want to keep you for hours.
Next year at the next conference.
Absolutely. So for anyone who wants to find more of your work, who wants to follow you, who wants to get more Kacey in their life, where can people find you?
Ooh, okay. Well,
if you want them to find you, of course.
Yeah, I mean, probably in terms, if you're interested in my kind of academic work, probably best on LinkedIn. So Kacey Martin, Kacey Martin on LinkedIn.
Link in
I'm
description
also
below.
on X, but I don't really post much on there. You can follow my Instagram, Kacey Martin. It's more of a personal, so I don't really post my research on there. But yeah, LinkedIn's probably the best bet if you want to follow kind of what I'm publishing, where my research is going, and yeah, stuff like that.
Amazing. It has been such a joy talking to you, Kacey. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and it's so great to reconnect again after our very quick little chat in Auckland. So yes, thank you so much. This has been a joy,
Oh,
and I'm
thank you for
sure
having
people
me.
listening. Oh, thank you, and I'm sure there are many people listening who will take so much out of this because I certainly have.
It's been a great first podcast experience.
Yes, thank you. I feel privileged that you were able to, have your first one with
My
us.
podcast virginity.
Well, I wasn't going to say that because I didn't want to, but I'm glad you said it because I was thinking it. That's all for today's podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss an episode. And if you like what you hear, please consider giving us a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. You can follow us on YouTube and Instagram at pavewithgoldpod. Send us an email at pavewithgoldpod@gmail.com or visit our website, pavewithgoldpodcast.com. All of those links will be in the show notes along with extra resources and where you can find Kacey. So until next time, stay safe and we'll talk to you again soon. Bye. This podcast is general in nature and has not taken your personal circumstances or medical history into account. We are here to share our own experiences and the things that we have found helpful throughout our own personal recovery journeys. Please remember that each person's journey and circumstances are different, and not all of the information contained in this podcast may be relatable to you. It's important you consult your own GP or recovery team to seek out tailored advice before making any important decisions relating to your own health and recovery process. If you have found any of the content in this episode distressing, please contact your care team or a medical professional. If you or someone you know is in crisis and needs help now, please contact emergency services in your region immediately.